just so angry that as a landlord, I shouldn't have to feel guilty about owning property or properties in our case. Why does it appear that all landlords are demonised and put in the same bracket? Why do politicians feel that they need to keep taxing or changing the rules for how to claim our legitimate business expenses? Owning property is a business and takes time and effort to make sure all is running smoothly.
I'm sorry, I just don't think that's fair.
Welcome to The Rational Woman. My name is Mai Bartlett. If you're new to my channel, here we are discussing everything philosophy, from personal relationship to geopolitical and economic issues. Let's get into today's video. So, today I saw a very interesting clip from the ABC on X, formerly Twitter, about the current housing crisis in Australia, where I live. Basically, here in Australia, the rent has been skyrocketing pretty much since the end of COVID. Let's have a look at the clip.
Just so angry that as a landlord, I shouldn't have to feel guilty about owning property or properties in our case. Why does it appear that all landlords are demonised and put in the same bracket? Why do politicians feel that they need to keep taxing or changing the rules for how to claim our legitimate business expenses? Owning property is a business and takes time and effort to make sure all is running smoothly.
I'm sorry, I just don't think that's fair. And the human consequences of a tax system and a rental system where a landlord can put up the rent by as much as they want at the end of every lease. Like, we desperately need caps on rent increases right now, because the human consequences of that are the people I've spoken to. Single mums choosing between buying their baby's nappy rash cream or paying the rent.
But isn't it the case that actually interest rates have risen as well, that some landlords actually are in significant financial trouble as well?
The worst consequences for that is selling an investment property and making a huge capital gains. The interests of landlords get put up against renters as if they are equal, but they are not, because if a renter loses their home, they're sleeping in their car on the street. If a property investor has to sell their home, that might be bad, but they still get a huge sale price out of that home.
Actually, most landlords, of course, are people who just are looking for a bit of a nest egg for their retirement. And I respect and acknowledge that and think it plays an important role. But I would ask you just to think about the experience, perhaps not of your tenants, but of other tenants, because the experiences that I've talked about, and even, Max has talked about, are real. And there is a growing number of people who are relying on rentals, and they have kids and they send their kids to school, and they need more stability in the rental experience.
Let's dissect the two opposing views in this video. So on one hand, we have the lady who's a landlord, who's saying that she shouldn't have to feel guilty for owning properties and charging the renters the market rate for it. On the other hand, we have the young man saying that it is not fair and that the landlords should not be able to increase rent at the end of each lease according to market price, and a rental price cap is needed. So he reckons that all they would take to solve this issue is for the government to come in and say that the rent cannot be higher than this amount. Well, let's look at some of these examples of instances of price control or price capped in history and see if they worked out well. So I have here rent control in New York City. This was during World War II and its aftermath. So in the short term, initially, rent control helped to keep housing affordable for low and middle income class families. It provided some stability for tenants during a time of housing shortages. However, in the long run, rent control led to a decrease in the quantity and quality of available rental units. Landlords has less incentive to maintain or improve their properties, leading to deteriorating housing conditions. Additionally, it contributed to a reduced supply of rental units, as developers were less inclined to build new apartments under strict rent control regulations. Okay, is there another example? Yes, so in the 1970s, In response to the 1973 oil crisis, the US government imposed price controls on gasoline to combat inflation and prevent price gouging. Initially, this helped to keep gasoline prices lower for consumers. However, the long-term effect of this was that price controls led to gasoline shortages and long lines at fuel stations, as artificially low prices increased demand but discouraged supply. The controls were eventually lifted, but they demonstrated how price caps can disrupt market equilibrium and lead to unintended consequences. So, market equilibrium, what does it mean? It's talking about the supply and demand of a free market. So the price of anything on the free market is set by the amount of supply and the amount of demand for that thing. So the higher the demand, provided supply stays the same, the higher the price will be pushed up. Think about it. If I was a landlord, I own a property, suddenly there are lots of people wanting to rent my property, a lot more than before. What do? I would give it to whoever can pay the highest amount of rent. So over time, on the average, from each day-to-day interaction between buyer and seller, the price gets pushed up. This is what we see. So what does it mean by having a price cap? Having a price cap means that the government comes in and say that the price of whatever that is, in our case, rental units, cannot be higher than this amount, regardless of how many people want it, demand, and how many people can supply it. Why would that be a problem in the long run? Well, when prices are high, usually it gives the builder, the supplier, an incentive to go out and supply more of the thing. So in our case, build more rental units. And at the same time, it discourages demand. So people who previously would want, let's say, a 2-bedroom apartment for themselves, leaving 1 bedroom empty, will now not want that. So they would go out to rent maybe a studio apartment and leave the 2-bedroom apartment for people who actually use 2 bedrooms to rent them. So the consumer will adjust their behavior to not have to pay as high of a price. So it reduces demand. And at the same time, it brings supply up to match with demand. So over time, we have demand going down, supply going up, and we have market equilibrium, which is a point where the price is stable, the buyers and the seller generally agree on a certain price for that thing, which is rental units. However, when the government comes in to say, you know what, can't be higher than $200 a week. Let's say if I was an investor, a property investor, I would not choose to build that new unit. Why? Because the cost might go up, but then I can't make enough profit to cover the cost. There is just not enough incentive for me to enter that market anymore. And the same thing for the consumer. So the consumer will continue to stay in that 2-bedroom apartment, leaving 1 room free, because the price has not been changed. So in the long run, price control has almost always led to long-term shortages. Let's also talk about why rent here in Australia has dramatically increased since the end of COVID. On one hand, we got the supply side of the equation. There has been a significant increase in demand for rental units here in Australia since the end of COVID. Why? Because Australia has seen a dramatic increase in the number of migrants and short-term visa holders. It is reported here in the financial year 2022-2023, the country recorded 737,000 migrant arrivals, up from 427,000 from the year before. This number has surpassed annual figures recorded pre-pandemic. So, on the demand side, lots of people coming into the country needing places to stay. However, that is not all. On the supply side, landlords also had to raise rent because the cost of owning properties has gone up dramatically since the end of COVID. Why? Because interest rates here in Australia have gone up. It is reported here since the end of COVID-19, the Reserve Bank of Australia, the RBA, has announced a total of 12 interest rate rises. These increases were part of the RBA's effort to manage inflation and support the Australian economy. So, inflation, where did we get it from? The government and everyone is acting as though inflation just happened out of the blue and it's just suddenly became a problem that we have to solve. But what was the cause of inflation? Well, it is reported here that the RBA started a quantitative easing program during COVID. The RBA started a program of government bond purchases focusing on the 5 to 10 year segment of the yield curve. The initial plan was to buy $100 billion of government bonds over 6 months, starting in November 2020. In February of 2021, the RBA announced that it would purchase an additional $100 billion of government bonds after its first program. Okay, so what is quantitative easing? Where does the RBA get all this money to buy government bonds and then injecting lots of liquidity or money into the system? Well, quantitative easing involves central banks creating new money electronically out of thin air and using it to buy financial assets such as government bonds or mortgage-backed securities from banks and other financial institutions, thereby in the process injecting more liquidity or more money into the system, money that is not backed up by any good or services. So in other words, the RBA created money out of thin air to buy government bonds and thereby artificially lowering interest rates and giving the government the power to have a crazy amount of government spending, aka fiscal spending, during COVID. So everyone here in Australia during COVID received job seeker benefit or unemployment benefit or job keeper benefit. So if the businesses that were forced to close were unable to pay their employees will receive a weekly or fortnightly wage as if they were working. In some cases, they will be making more, like double the amount that they would make had they worked. So now we have a massive problem on our hand, that is inflation. So basically, we have lots of people with more purchasing power, either through borrowing through extremely cheap interest rate or by literally receiving money from the government without actually contributing to the production of goods and services. So there's been no increase in goods or services, but there's been a massive increase in the amount of currency, money, floating around in the system. So what we see is inflation. Inflation here in Australia has gotten as high as 6.something%, and that is the government reported figure. But I bet that if you go out to the supermarket, you go to the shops, you find some items have increased in price as high as 50 to 100%. So that has forced the RBAs to increase interest rates dramatically, many times, to combat inflation. So that has pushed up the cost of owning property here in Australia a lot just from the interest payment alone. Because most people here in Australia don't buy their property outright, but they would have a home loan attached to it. So that means we have to pay an amount of interest every month. And the higher the interest rate, the more we will have to pay. But all of this aside, putting the economic problems aside, let's talk about philosophy. That is what we're here to do. That is what this channel is about. So what is philosophy? Philosophy is a system of beliefs that everyone has about the world. Everyone has it, whether they consciously know it and admit it to themselves or not. For example, one belief would be, do I believe men are different from women? I have to answer that question, whether consciously through the evidence that I can gather from my perception of the world through my eyes and ears, or from reading, taking in information independently and coming to form an opinion. Or I can take that opinion at face value by looking at other people's or the society around me. So in other words, some people consciously build that system and some people just absorb whatever is given to them. But that is philosophy. Everyone who is a human being, who is alive, has this system of beliefs in order to function in the world. So let's discuss the philosophy that is inherent in this video. So the basic philosophical premise of the young man's beliefs is that because the consequence for the landlord is so much less severe than the consequence for the renter, let's say she's a single mom who can't afford diapers for her kids, so that's not fair. What he's essentially saying is that needs should be the metric on which we judge right from wrong, and what's fair and what's unfair. What he's saying is that it shouldn't matter how much profit the landlord makes, because the single mother's need for a place to stay is so much more important. The biggest consequence for the landlord would be to have to sell their property. But here's the issue with that statement. If enough landlords sell their properties, the price will go down, making it unprofitable to buy or own investment property, thus restricting long-term supplies because, again, the incentive to buy and build investment property is now removed. So in the long run, we're back to square one. We have even worse housing shortages because in the long run, supply is restricted. So the renters who would need it most will end up paying an even higher price in the long run. But I doubt that was what was going through his mind. What he wanted the landlords to do is to keep the property at the low rental price for the sake of that single mother, even though they are not making any profit on it. Let me ask you, would you keep something that is losing you money for the sake of a stranger? Well, according to his argument, if your answer is no, you should feel shamed and guilt. He's essentially saying that the single mother's needs should come first before your profits, regardless of how long or how hard you worked to buy that investment property. He's essentially saying that the landlord's effort and time that was used to be able to purchase that investment property should now be used to keep someone else and their children in a comfortable living condition. Well, why stop at just rental properties? Why don't we apply the same logic to all the other markets? One would argue that the food market, for example, is even more important because food is even more essential than rental units. If you don't eat, you die. So why don't we say to the farmers that we're just going to put a price cap on all your potatoes and your corns, whatever they're growing, regardless of how much the cost for you to grow those potato and corns have gone up. Why? Because the single mom and their children need to eat. After all, the consequence for the farmer is only to lose their profit, but the consequence for the single mom would be that they will die. So, he's saying that the farmers, their effort, their ideas, the risk that they chose to take to invest in the farms and the farm equipment and everything in order to produce the potatoes or the corns, all of that should now go out the window. All of that should not be justified by the amount of profit that they stand to make. All of that should now be used to keep the single mother and their children alive because they need it. So, what he's essentially saying is that the farmer's time, farmer's effort, the farmer's ideas should not be directed at his own benefit. It should be directed at the single mother's benefit. And we wonder why the farmers say, fuck it, I quit. And you know what? I would too. And this is what happened many times before in history. This is the young man's belief, is the philosophy of parasitism. It's that my needs should be the metric on which your life's work is based upon. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, whether you agree with me, why or why not. Until next time, stay rational.